I know that you guys all had to pass the Constitution test in middle school, and you probably think this is a huge review because you probably got 100% on that test. It's still important that we recognize really the foundation of our laws in the United States so that we can understand really what's happened in the 230 or so years since it actually became a reality. But it's important to sort of pick up where we left off, which was Shays' Rebellion, these concerns about the mobocracy, all of the problems with the Articles of Confederation, the inability to regulate trade, to really forcefully collect taxes, to raise troops, to fight off foreign threats. All of those are problems that the Founding Fathers realize when they come to Philadelphia. Now, they don't come to Philadelphia with the express reason of creating a new constitution or a new set of laws. They come ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. That's the official reason that they come. And so what's important to realize is that as they sort of quickly decide, you know what, we need something entirely different, they have to make a whole bunch of compromises because despite the fact that they generally agree that the Articles of Confederation isn't working, they come from small states, big states, they come from slave states, they come from free states, and so they're going to have to really negotiate to figure out what is exactly going to work. Now, despite their differences, they generally shared an opinion that the national government must have direct authority over the people rather than the state governments having that power. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the state governments essentially were almost like sovereign nations, and that had really not worked out as far as the Founding Fathers were concerned. They also felt that the national government must sort of derive its legitimacy, must sort of get its source of power from the people rather than the state governments. Now, that whole idea is enshrined in the idea of we the people. Now, the real question is how much power would, quote, the people ever get, but at least the Founding Fathers paid some lip service to that. Now, they realized quickly that the mistakes of the Articles of Confederation had to be fixed. That you had to be able to have a strong national government that could collect taxes, that could borrow and issue money, that could regulate commerce, that could actually fund an army and a navy and create laws that people would follow. They were concerned about sort of this sense of lawlessness and vulnerability. And they really thought these states should not have the power to print their own money, which is creating problems, to make treaties, to levy tariffs on each other. Now, they're not going to completely take power away from the states. That would not have worked. That compromise would have, or that wouldn't have been a compromise. So the main compromise that you need to understand is something called federalism. And under federalism, the agreement would be that the federal government would have certain powers and the state government would have certain powers. In theory, it's supposed to be balanced. There are certain clauses written into the Constitution, particularly the Commerce Clause, which gives the federal government power over interstate commerce, something that's called the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause basically says that if the state government and the federal government basically have conflicting laws, the federal government would win. And then something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is complicated, but basically it says there are certain things that the federal government is permitted to do. Yet there are also other things that it might need to do in order to do the things that it is expressly allowed to do. So basically, it's a set of sort of unwritten things it can do to ensure that it can do the things that are written. Much more complicated. We'll talk about it much more under Hamilton in the next chapter, or not under Hamilton, but Hamilton really liked that idea. But those together, the Commerce Clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause, all end up sort of tilting the scales much more in favor of a large central government rather than sort of the balance that was supposed to be in theory for federalism. Now that's sort of the big compromise. Like some power is going to be with the federal government, some's going to be with the states. But they had to also figure out what is this government going to be comprised of? What are its component parts going to be? So they agreed that it would be divided into three parts. That's what we call separation of power. And each of those parts, each of those branches would have its own function. Now, the executive branch would be the president, which they did not have really any sort of president under the Articles of Confederation. The executive branch, you can see the word execute, as in they would execute or carry out the laws that are passed by Congress. I'll get to Congress in just a second. The judicial branch you can see the word sort of judge and judicial. That would be the court system, even most prominently the Supreme Court. But at the beginning, it really didn't spell out much of the Supreme Court would do. In fact, there's very little of the Constitution, if you have a pocket Constitution, that actually says, what exactly the judicial branch will do. It said that it would interpret laws passed by Congress, but it didn't really say much more. And in fact, that's not really going to get resolved until really the first famous Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison in 1803. But we want to focus most on the legislative branch because we'd already had a legislative branch under the Articles of Confederation. And the question is, are we going to keep it just like that under the Constitution? And so you had two different real ideas. One was called the Virginia Plan, brought up by James Madison, who's really thought to be the sort of the godfather of the Constitution. And his proposal was, instead of having a unicameral or one House Congress like they had under the Articles of Confederation, there should be a bicameral or two-house legislature. And he argued that there should be what we call sort of a lower house and an upper house. And the lower house would be chosen by the voters, okay, the people in the country. They would actually elect representatives in their state, so it would be the people in the state. And then the upper house would actually be chosen, those members would be chosen by the state legislatures themselves. So of those two, only the lower house would actually have the people directly voting for it. The upper house would be indirect. You'd vote for legislators in your state legislature, and then they would choose. And overall, the goal here was, if the bigger the state was, the more representatives you would have in these two different houses. That was what the large state plan was. Again, Virginia being one of the largest states. Now, on the flip side, delegates from New Jersey said, whoa. We don't want to have a government where we basically have no voice. We want to ensure that the smaller states have a voice. So they proposed something that said we want to have equal representation in a one-house legislature. They basically proposed the same thing as they had under the Articles of Confederation. They just wanted to make sure that in some way their voice wasn't completely drowned out. So the famous compromise, known as the Great Compromise, or brought to you by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, so it was also called the Connecticut Compromise, took features of both the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. And so the bigger states would have the House of Representatives. That would be good for them because the House of Representatives would be based on population. The Senate, the upper house, would be the same for every state. It would be two for every state. So House based on population, Senate two per state. In the House of Representatives, the people would be elected every 2 years. Basically, people could never really get comfortable in the House. They had to constantly be really asking their constituents, the voters, what do you want? The senators, again, who were going to be elected by the state legislatures, which was a feature, again, of the Virginia Plan, they would be in there for 6 years, so they would not be running for re-election as often. So they'd be sort of much more insulated from the will of the people, and the Senate, the upper house, would be considered more prestigious overall. Now, in the presidency, again, there was a concern that you didn't want to create a king. You wanted to create somebody who had power, who could direct the country, but really was limited in some ways. The main power that was given to the president was any law that is passed by Congress could be vetoed. So the president really had the power of the pen. In order for it to go into action, he would have to sign it, but if he didn't like it, he could veto it. Now, that wasn't the end. They actually gave Congress a power that says, Congress, you can sort of say no to his no. You can override his veto, but it's a really hard threshold to get to. To have 2/3 of the House and the Senate override is very challenging. Doesn't happen very much in American history, but it certainly has happened. Now, the president was designed to wear sort of many hats, to play many roles. It was supposed to be the chief diplomat, namely negotiating with other countries. Supposed to execute the laws. Again, Congress would pass them, the president and his branch would actually carry them out. And then also that the president would be the commander-in-chief of the military, which, again, George Washington, first president, sort of made sense. We're going to have a military person in that role. But what's interesting is, despite the fact that the president is in fact the commander-in-chief, the president cannot declare war. Only Congress has that power. Now, that's going to be that line's going to be blurred at times throughout our history, particularly with the Vietnam conflict with Lyndon Baines Johnson, but that's way off into the future, okay? Now, there was this question of, how does a president get elected? Is it going to be by the people? Is it going to be by Congress? And this, there was some real concern that the ignorant people wouldn't know, but there was also some concern that Congress would just pick other elites. So they came up with something called the Electoral College, where basically the people in a state would elect electors, and these sort of more knowledgeable people would actually formally elect the president. And the number of electoral votes that you had was basically the number of representatives you had plus senators. So every state had 2 senators and at least 1 representative. So the minimum was 3. And we'll talk more about that, how the South actually got more power through having slaves. But then there was this question of, well, how long is a president going to serve? Can a president be removed? And it was agreed that presidents would serve 4-year terms, but there was no stipulation in the Constitution of how many terms that you could serve. And it's only going to be George Washington stepping down after 2 terms that sets up that sort of unofficial precedent. But there was some question, what happens if the president is doing what we don't want? And so there was this idea of impeachment. Impeachment means a formal accusation, and that's done by the House of Representatives. So all it took was a majority of the House to say, we think you've broken the rules. Now, that doesn't mean the president is removed. It means then that it goes to the Senate, who serves as really the jury. And so they listen to the accusations, and they decide, is the president guilty? And if so, would be removed. Now, it takes 2/3 of the Senate. Again, a very hard number to get to. We've had 2 presidents that have actually been impeached. Andrew Johnson, who came after Lincoln, and then Bill Clinton, again, in the last couple of decades. Both were impeached, that means formally accused, but neither one was actually removed. So you had this federalism compromise, the compromise of, states are going to get some power, federal government's going to get power, and then you had this sort of separation of powers dividing into 3 different branches, and then you have certain checks and balances within that to make sure that no one has too much power. And then there was the question of slavery, which obviously pitted the northern states against the southern states. So the southern states weren't planning to give up slavery at all, and in fact, if there had been any real substantial talk about ending slavery, the Southerners would have taken their ball and gone home. They would have said, you know what, we don't need this. We're not going to be part of this. So the compromise had to figure out not whether they're going to have slavery or not, but how slaves are going to be counted. Now, Southerners said, we would like every slave that we have to be counted as one white person, the same as one white person, when it comes to counting population, which would have helped them in the House of Representatives. The more people you have, the more representatives you have in the House, and the more power you have. The Northerners said, excuse me, why should you be rewarded for having slaves? We want them to count as 0. Southerners said, we would like all of our slaves to be counted as 0 when it comes to taxation. We don't actually want to pay any extra money because of our slaves. The North said it would make total sense if they counted as 1 person for taxation. So again, the South wanted 1 for representation, the North wanted 0 for taxation, the North wanted 1, the South wanted 0. And oddly, again, they came up with 3/5 as a number. It's a number in the at the time that people believed that a black person could only do 3/5 the work of a white person, which is ridiculous. If that was the case, why weren't white people doing all the work? But that's where the number 3/5 comes from. So that's really an important compromise. At the end of the day, again, there was nothing mentioned about ending slavery. There was an agreement that the slave trade would end on December 31st, 1807, but that was like 20 years into the future. And in fact, slavery is not even mentioned. Free persons and all other persons are mentioned, but slaves are not mentioned at all. In fact, you won't even see anything about slaves until slavery is actually abolished with the 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War. Now, another piece that's interesting there is that the only people that are really defined as citizens are white people. And so over time, you're going to have to see amendments added to the Constitution regarding African Americans, regarding Native Americans. So again, Congress is given power over naturalization. That means citizenship, but really citizenship was only for white people. Now I'm going to stop right here because I'm running out of time, but I'm going to pick up really with this question of, in the next lecture, what happens once you've finished the Constitution? How does it actually go into effect?